welcome to the fourth session of Liberal. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of Liberal Youth Congress, organized by 3H Movement, sponsored by the Frederick Neumann Foundation. Today, we are going to talk about democratic protests in Belarus. As you may all know, after the presidential election in August, Lukashenko claimed to a landslide victory, which was obviously fraudulent and illegitimate. Thousands of people after that in Minsk took the streets to demonstrate against the oppressive regime of Lukashenko, demanding his resignation. We are going to discuss basically the dynamics of this non-violent protest and its future. I am happy to introduce our two guests, Sven Gers and Katsiarnia Shimitsina. Katsiarnia Shimitsina is a research fellow at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. She graduated from Belarus Law School and holds a master's degree in Syracuse University. Sven Gers is a liberal activist and academic. He is the Secretary General of International Federation of Liberal Youth. He also has been living in Belarus for a while as an expert, so he kind of have first-hand experience as a foreigner what's happening in there. I would like to begin discussion with a question on how the global pandemic affected the social and political atmosphere in Belarus, because we know that Lukashenko did not take seriously the COVID pandemic situation. How did it affect the election, and what kind of role did it play in the spark of non-violent democratic protest? Shimitsina?
So I would say that the timing was coinciding in terms of the COVID pandemic and the presidential campaign in Belarus. And first of all, when the pandemic started, the Belarusian authorities did not take this situation seriously. They denied the scale of the problem and did not introduce any quarantine measures. And in fact, the figures that on statistics on COVID patients that was announced by state agencies, it was not accurate, it was covered up. And the medical staff who dared to challenge these official figures, who dared to criticize the work of the Ministry of Health, they did face some sort of repressions. Some faced fines at work, some were even fired from their jobs. And at the same time, the people, the ordinary people, did not believe this official information. And there were a lot of memes comparing this official response of the Belarusian authorities to the situation after Chernobyl catastrophe that happened in this USSR, which was also covered up. And people realized that their health is in danger, but it's also in their own hands to save themselves, to try to go on self-isolation. And there were many volunteering initiatives where people did crowdfund money to provide hospitals with necessary hygiene products and masks and so on, and also to help each other and to provide reliable information to each other and to journalists. So this created the sufficient background of discontent moods before the presidential campaign happened. And of course, it added up on the overall discontent of the Lukashenko regime. And then what was happening during the presidential campaign was that Lukashenko removed the frontrunners from the presidential race, anyone who posed a threat to him, and people were still gathering at that time when they saw that this new elections would be very much predictable, they would be fraudulent, and Lukashenko wants to re-elect himself. At that time, again, during the pandemic, people still gathered on the street for the rallies to support their candidates, to gather signatures. They were standing in long lines, regardless of the risks of COVID. Like the political motivation, the mood, the request for change was that strong that people still like risk their health again to collect signatures for the presidential candidates. And what we observe now is that we've crossed the line of this 3 months of the protests so far, and people still keep showing up on the streets. And there is sort of the second wave of the pandemic situation. Still, this does not stop people from fighting for democracy, because the Belarusians have again crossed this line of fear and intolerance for the current political regime.
Sven, would you agree with Chimitsina that this pandemic situation somehow it triggered the eruption of this non-violent democratic protest in Belarus?
Yeah, certainly. It took the role of a catalyst, right? So in a sense, there has been some discontent, but mostly amongst, I would say, middle-class Belarusians with how the government was proceeding economic growth over the last couple of years. However, this operated as a catalyst to shatter somehow the impression that Lukashenko and his regime wants to give to themselves, right? Lukashenko has always tried to portray himself as like the father of the nation, and to a certain degree has implemented this picture in the minds of people very successfully. However, when there is a global pandemic and you're kind of telling people that you dismiss their legitimate concerns for such things, then this image of course immediately gets shattered. And I think this is a crucial way to understand where Lukashenko stands at the moment. I think this portrayal was not longer to be upheld, and that what caused not only this discontent to mount, but really his public impression. And that's why maybe also now he's much more ruthless in public. I mean, he has been ruthless in private much more in the past when you look at how dissidents have been treated in the past, but now it's all also in public, and it's because there is no attempt to portray himself as the father of the nation. He gets booed when he goes on the stage in even the tractor factory or whatsoever. So I think this is an important catalyst of accelerating this, that he doesn't care about the people. And as I said, this is now very manifested. The way he treated people called people rats from the helicopter is also a meme that has been circulated around for a while now. So this image is shattered. And the second, as Katarina has already outlined, it created kind of a structure in Belarusian society that is now kind of harvested for political reasons. So if civil society had to organize themselves to fight the pandemic with crowdfunding initiatives for medical equipment, that is something that is now used for political reasons, because people organize themselves outside of government structures to provide these medical equipments. And that's something, again, this has kind of fueled the protests that we are seeing now, because without this digital infrastructure that we now see, I don't think this would have been possible. So in a sense, there are two dimensions that this two dimensions that this protest took. One was like shattering the public image and the kind of portray that Lukashenko wants to have, and the second is it created a public infrastructure that could also be used not only for organizing to get medical equipment, but also for political purposes, and that's what we are seeing now.
Well, in the September, when we look at the news about the Belarus in foreign media, we saw that there's a real possibility that Lukashenko might be leave the power. But when we look at the situation right now, and in the last weeks, we have seen that state factory workers, students, miners went on the strike in Belarus. So it kind of seems that Lukashenko also started to lose his grip on his traditional base. But yet he still managed to hold on the power. Basically, what keeps him in power? The external alliances that he forged with Russia and China, or is there any political, economic, social dynamics that are playing in Belarusian society? Chimitsina?
First, I would note there was a lot of media attention to the strikes that were announced in the previous weeks, and also sort of critical comments that the nationwide strikes did not really happen, that the workers are not protesting at all enterprises, and people are wondering why is this so, why Belarusians did not fight so desperately. But I want to outline just to bring this up, that when people dared to speak up, and the few workers who dared to join the strike, they were immediately facing repressions. There were cases where people had to flee the country literally the same day they announced the strike. And I was one of those volunteers across the border who were helping those people to find accommodation and abroad when they managed to escape. And there were cases when people were brought to mental health institutions after making those statements on social media that they joined the strike. And so also, with this recent outrageous death, what happened to a guy, Roman Bondarenko, who was beaten to death by Siloviki in unmarked clothes like a few days ago. This just shows this horrible response of the Lukashenko regime to its own people, and their motivation to to suppress people and to spill blood, to do whatever it takes to hold to power. And I think I was saying this, let's say, like from the first days of the protest, is that on one hand, we have the people's mood where people have crossed this line of no return, of not tolerating this autocratic, now bloody regime anymore. And on the other side, we have Lukashenko and his inner circle, who has little and like less and less to lose. Less and less incentives to give up. To resign, because he and his inner circle are more and more complicit in tortures and crimes which are now recognized as actually international crimes, which could be prosecuted even outside Belarus, like crimes against basic human rights, etc. And when we talk about like what holds Lukashenko now, why he is still staying in power. He consolidated the regime and the power vertical and the Siloviki structures for years. He stayed in power for 26 years, and he started to eliminate all the independence of all the branches of power from the first days of his presidency back in 1994-95. And since then, he took under control like all the bureaucracy system. All the power vertical was essentially serving his interests, and he also, in the Siloviki structure, they get enormous financing just to maintain this loyalty. Currently, they have their personal guarantees. No one was ever, during these 3 months, there was not a single case of prosecution, investigation into the unlawful deeds committed by, again, Siloviki police. And so they have lots of incentives. I mean, those people among the police and paramilitary structures, they have incentives to oppress people. They get special financing conditions and an absolute impunity they enjoy so far. And so I would say that at the moment, domestically, Lukashenko has the support of this structures he relies on, again, Siloviki and sort of some people among the political elites. But again, the Siloviki are the most loyal because they have a lot to lose in case of Lukashenko steps down. And I would also bring up the comments which were made a while ago, a few years ago, by former KGB agent who resigned, fled to Sweden, and then made his commentary on how the Lukashenko system works from inside. And he was saying that all the structures, especially inside the KGB, they serve the interests of Lukashenko, especially before the elections. And that's the way they are trained to do so before the presidential campaign, to consolidate all their efforts, finances, resources, to intimidate their opponents, political opponents, opposition. And the way they are trained is to say that either we win this or we all lose, and we will lose our jobs and we will go to prison. So for those people who are mostly complicit in tortures and unlawful deeds, the stakes are really high, and the matter for their actual like personal safety. So I would say, like, domestically, Lukashenko relies on those people inside the Siloviki structures. And then when we talk about the outside support, well, actually, like the most obvious ally and supporter is Russia. And we can observe this at the level of rhetoric coming from Kremlin when they do not condemn Lukashenko so much and sort of provide some rhetorical support to Lukashenko and even some money which were promised to Belarus a few months ago, which are directed to sustain Belarusian economy during this post-election crisis. But I would say that even Kremlin supports Lukashenko so far with a certain level of cautiousness. They do not opt in for him explicitly. they are rather remaining as bystanders in the current situation, because even Kremlin understands that Lukashenko is now illegitimate and he is toxic to his own people, but also a toxic politician to deal with. And it is not a secret that Putin and Lukashenko are not friends, and that Lukashenko is not the best counterpart, not the most favorable counterpart to deal with from Moscow's point of view. And this could be an opportunity for Putin to get rid of him, get rid of Lukashenko, and then possibly to try to facilitate another political figure to come to the political stage in Belarus, someone who would be at least more predictable and more convenient for Kremlin. And then, and I would say that so far, from the moves we've seen from Kremlin, there was not so much actual explicit support or any action. Kremlin rather remains as a observer of the situation, trying to seek or maybe calculate how they can use the situation to their advantage. But they're not, again, not very active in the situation so far. And also at the same time, for Moscow to support the win of the protest, the democratic victory, that looks like an unfavorable option in their eyes, because, well, for the nature of the non-democratic nature of decision makers in Moscow. And also that would be way too obvious and unfavorable decision to sort of set a bad example across the border for those who are unhappy with the current political situation in Russia, with those protests in Khabarovsk, etc. So for Russia, the most favorable solution would be to see the change of leadership in Belarus, but to see someone who does not come to power as a direct result of the protest. And then when it comes to China maintains very silent in this situation and sort of withdraws from the current situation. They did congratulate Lukashenko with the victory at the elections, but that's pretty much it. And for China, of course, they sort of support the autocratic leadership with whom they have some sort of ideological similarities. But for China, Belarus is very pragmatic place of interest. They're mostly interested economically in cooperations with Belarus, to the extent it provides a window to Europe, to EU for the transfer of goods, for the railway connections, and for the logistical purposes, and for the investment opportunities. So for China, the stability in Belarus is #1 priority, and they do not have much political interest in Belarus so far. So they rather stay distant in the situation, and I don't think they would interfere in any case, particularly because they consider this part of the region as the sort of legitimate sphere of interest of Russia.
Well, Sven, what's your take on that? The factors that are behind Lukashenko still maintains his power.
Yeah, I think most has been said already, but I fully agree that the current structures are set up in a way that it maintains Lukashenko's power. So in political economy, you look at regimes from the perspective of Hirschman, for example. So you have you look at 3 options. There's an exit option, there are options of voice where you can change certain things of the regime, or there is full loyalty option. So at the moment, it seems like there is only loyalty that leaves it to law enforcement, right? Law enforcement is basically left with the only option to stay loyal to Lukashenko, because there's no real exit option, because as we have said already, they are already complicit in human rights violations. They are complicit in the many misdeeds that have been now carried out for weeks. So I think that option is to a certain degree gone, and I think it becomes more gone with evidence that we are passing, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya tweeted the other day or gave a press release where she talks about the tribunal that will people hold accountable for their deeds. So that, of course, perspective of what are the exit options of people that are currently in power to overcome the regime. Because part of what allowed the fall of the Soviet Union was, of course, the exit options that were there. The second option of voice, I don't think that the law enforcement has at this place many ways to change the regime, the way it is set up. In a New York Times piece, like just I think 1 or 2 days ago, somebody said, and I think this is very crucial to understand, that people are not serving the Belarusian state anymore, but they are serving Lukashenko almost personally now. So this is, there's no voice option that you could have to change the direction of where the country is heading. And that leaves basically open in this Hirschman framework that you only have loyalty left to you and basically somehow try to survive to this together. And this is how the current power structure is set up. And that is to a certain degree, first of all, worrisome, and second, also to me, unexpected. I would have expected that in the beginning, there might be some sort of internal rotation within the power structures, like some other people of the regime might take over, like the foreign minister or whatsoever, to replace Lukashenko, because as we have already said, he is by now acknowledged by everybody in the game that he's a toxic leader and that he doesn't have support by the people anymore. And if you have had a look at the Chatham House study that was released like 2 or 3 weeks ago about the decline of support for Lukashenko, it's just staggering that there is almost like a national consensus that he has not only rigged the election, but that he's also that he also should resign. So if this is the national consensus by a vast majority now, then it's very hard to see how this whole thing could collapse. Just 1 or 2 sentences on the foreign actors. I think a lot of people are always curious about the role of the EU, the role of Russia, and I mean, I would say I would, to a degree, neglect the Chinese relationship because, as Katerina has said, this is like purely pragmatic, it seems. Belarusians take this as a Belarusian issue. And of course, they always look towards the Kremlin. They look much less so to the EU. So when people ask me about what is the role of the EU, it's not that people are talking here about the EU a great deal. They look what Russia is doing to a certain degree, but mostly it's really a Belarusian issue. And as I said, people really don't understand how people can be complicit in these acts that are carried out against their own population. But I hope this kind of framework of Hirschman makes us understand why this is happening in a way it is. And if there's no exit option, well, let's see where this is going.
Well, you just mentioned the setup that favors Lukashenko's regime, but when you look at the analysis that's on Belarus politics, what we see is that overemphasis on Lukashenko role in the way of more democratic Belarus. Do you think that that's portrayal of Belarus politics disregards the rooted social and economic problems that blocks a more democratic Belarus? Shmitsina?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Could you please repeat it?
Yeah, sure. Well, we just mentioned the some social setup and economic setup that favored Lukashenko's regime. But when people make analysis on Belarus politics, this is what I see at least. They disregard these social and economic factors and overemphasize the role of Lukashenko in the way of more democratic Belarus. So do you think this kind of overlooks the problem, or yeah, that's the question.
So when we talk about the overall discontent with Lukashenko, certainly the lack of economic development, economic prosperity for Belarus, and sort of the broken social contract which we observed in the past years, which means like less social security, less support from the state to the vulnerable groups. Certainly this is the case, and Belarusian leadership, well, essentially like led by Lukashenko, he made very poor decisions in terms of not conducting structural reforms, which were long overdue compared to our neighboring countries, and the level of life is not sort of the best one compared to our neighbors, especially to EU neighbors in the Baltic states. which were having similar economic conditions and hardships after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then they made a transition to the market economies and had a more competitive markets conditions and more efficient management system. And now they're doing better off in many domains and are much more attractive in the sense of security for the investments, for the foreign investments, etc. So certainly there is this discontent on many levels on, let's say, like of the people with the lower income groups. They are dissatisfied with the state's inability to actually provide some sort of like better salaries or social security guarantees on behalf of businesses. The business has lots of burdens in terms of like many fines, restrictions, very restrictive laws compared again to their peers in other countries. So this discontent sort of added up for years, and then for years we decided, I mean, not us, but the official Minsk, the Belarusian government decided to depend on essentially cheap Russian money, which sustained the regime and Belarusian economy in exchange for some political economic trade-offs to Russia. And the regime sort of got along with not conducting painful but much needed structural reforms. But when we talk about the current protest, it's not, and this is something I would say like I'm proud of the Belarusians, being myself a Belarusian. This protest, it's not about people demanding better salaries or saying that like we want to have, I don't know, more money from the government, something like the compensation for the COVID related losses for the economy. This is about the dignity, and this protest is political. And what is important is that it started on the day of the elections. It started as a protest against Lukashenko, against the fraudulent elections, how the electoral commissions falsified the results on the polling stations. But over time, it even became more political in a sense that people who were previously did not care much about politics, who could have been indifferent to whoever, what's the name of the president of the country, I'm just minding my own business, I don't care, I even don't go to the to vote on the election day, I'm doing fine. Now even those people are joining the protest, and it is hard to stay apolitical when you see that people are being grabbed on the street for essentially like for not doing anything violent or something against the law. And now people join the protest when they see the scale of injustice and then the tortures, cruelties that are happening against someone they know. And then their cruelty is happening even not only with regards to the protesters, but to people who were just passing by on their way to the grocery store. And now every Belarusian has a friend or a relative or a friend of a friend who was sort of a victim of this cruelty of the police. And this is something that consolidates people even more than any economic hardship or discontent, anything more than just, I don't know, like the COVID pandemic related losses to the economy, or even much more than just the general conversation about democratic values. And this creates such a strong request for change for people. Like that's just a basic request for people to be respected and the basic request for human dignity. So I would say that this is something that fuels the protest now.
Well, when I was preparing for this discussion, I came across with other massive non-violent democratic protests in Belarus politics, like after the 2010 presidential election, in which demonstrators were violently suppressed, like today. Do you think this recent democratic protest is strikingly different from the previous one? Over the years, how do you think the opposition is evolved to confront Lukashenko? Sven?
I mean, it's for me harder to estimate like how what it has changed in the past, because in the past I have not been based in Belarus. So for me, I read mostly about this, of course, in academic papers or in history books. But I can do a couple of things, or I can say a couple of things that I think are interesting. First of all, I want to bolster the point that Katarina just made about the dignity. And I think that is, first of all, a political move in order to have the most common denominator as a movement behind. So people rally behind very basic principles of dignity. For example, that their vote should count, right? That political prisoners should be released and that there should not be violence against ordinary citizens. And whenever people deviate from that very broad messaging, like, for example, want to set up a political party at the moment, which people have tried or people have announced, then they get a certain backlash from the movement, because at the moment people want to really overcome this Lukashenko regime. This is like anti-Lukashenko protests, and it's not necessarily about the economic situation. It's not necessarily about how Lukashenko handled COVID. I mean, these are all catalysts or like background factors. Now it's really about I would say these dignity factors that are ingrained in these basic three propositions that I just outlined. And I think that's crucial to understand how we see this movement, because at the moment this is not in a sense comparable to some past movements where there was a clearer political agenda. Some opposition candidates in the past have, for example, proposed a more pro-European agenda. Others were in the system and then were taken out of the system and kind of formed an opposition, and they had political structures or some sort of political structures behind. This all doesn't exist in the current protests. So therefore, in that sense, the mass protests are not only new in their scale, because I mean, if somebody would have told me at the beginning of the year that like 300,000 people will take it to the streets in August in Minsk, I would say like that's a crazy idea, knowing the level of politicization, which is very low in Belarus. So that the scale is surprising. Second, I think it is surprising that there's no real structure behind all of this. It's not like that there's a political party who rallies up, that there's a clear leader figure who rallies that up, that there are clear civil society structures. If you compare it, for example, with Ukraine and the protests around Euromaidan, that had completely different structures behind it, right? Or like divisions in society that they could bolster upon. Like the situation in Belarus is quite different from that. So I think these are interesting insights in how things are going. And one important aspect too is the solidarity that it created amongst people. Like we have in our neighborhood also like neighborhood fests outside of outside in the country yard, or like in the neighborhood gardens. You know, there's an incredible sense of solidarity amongst people now, and a level of politicization that I have not seen in Belarus before, where people tend to talk about politics. They're very shy in talking about politics. I think this is from my perspective, from an outsider who has been to many different countries looking at its politics and very oppressive regimes like China, Azerbaijan, Russia, or whatsoever. Here, people are very shy to talk about politics at the kitchen table or whatsoever. But now this is everywhere. Like politics is literally everywhere, from the cabs to like birthday parties. You know, like it's really literally everywhere. And these are dynamics that I think are new and that hasn't been there before.
Thank you. Katerina, when you look at this recent democratic protest and the previous one, what kind of differences and similarities you see, but mostly the way that protesters are organized and confront the Lukashenko?
So I want to say that there was the opposition to Lukashenko literally from the first days he came in power back in the 90s. It's just he started to take control over the power vertical and the police structures as well, and started to intimidate his opponents at that times. There was a time when the parliament was opposing his decisions, and the MPs were actually beaten by police. Well, there were cases when his opponents disappeared, and later there appeared evidence that those people were killed. And their bodies were never found. And at that times, there were also some, let's say, like major demonstrations on the streets, which later became outlawed and prosecuted by the police. And the laws were rewritten in the way that it actually makes it impossible for people to gather on the street. And the law enforcement practices changed in a way that if a person, it was actually impossible to show up on the street with any sort of poster, to even like if you show up alone or with a smaller group of people, you would be taken by police in the, I don't know, like in 5 minutes and taken to the police station. And so, and at the time, it was also like the laws governing the like the political parties, the work of the NGOs was really tough and still is. And I just want to provide a background, like better understanding on in what conditions any civil initiative or political initiative existed, compared to maybe some like Western countries where things are easier in that regard. And I would say that even until recently in Russia, when we compare those like political, the level of personal political freedom in Russia, let's say like in 2011, in Belarus and in Russia, there seemed like there's so much more freedom for in Russian society that compared to what was happening in Belarus. And even at that background, there were happening some major protests, and the largest ones were in 2006, 2010, after the elections. But I think that at that time, there was not so much widespread discontent happening. There were some political groups who were opposing Lukashenko, but the larger society was remaining apolitical and sort of passive. And this made it possible for the police at that time to disperse the crowds. Like, let's say in 2010, there were 600 or 700 people detained overnight, those who were gathering on the street to protest the elections. And then the major opponents of the elections, the presidential candidates, were detained, put in prison. And this made, at that time, it seemed like, oh, we haven't seen that much cruelty happening before. But then this, like the police cleaned up the street, and people sort of were very much like depressed and demotivated, but it did not inspire more protest. There were some less visible protests happening in 2017 when Lukashenko decided to tax people, those who have lost their jobs, or like those who are not employed. That was called the parasite tax law. And this was having like the protest against this law when people were gathering across Belarus. This law had sort of the economic discontent as core, I mean, the protests. And this made some, at that time, the presidential administration, they realized that they have adopted or like inspired for something unpopular measures, and they decided to sort of roll back those measures, regulations, and the law was changed. And no one expected that this protest would unravel this time, because the previous elections, 2015, they were very peaceful. They were sort of peacefully orchestrated in the sense that the society was not so much mobilized. But I think that this time we have seen this coincidence of many factors which sort of coincided together, this COVID pandemic and the overall occurring discontent with one person staying in power, consolidating power. And also what was actually different this time is that there were new political figures appearing on the political arena, because in the previous years, the opposition was more or less homogeneous, coming from the same group of the old school opposition structures, from the same political parties, and not all of them enjoyed much political support. And this time we had a few frontrunners, including the blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky, and then former diplomat Valery Tsepkalo, and then a banker, Viktor Babarika. And those people, they sort of jumped into the political stage during these elections, and they were, in their teams, they had so many creative people, from I don't know, like creative PR agencies, those who created so much well presented, well packed promo materials, some slogans which mobilized people's interest to politics. And they enjoyed more support than the sort of the old school opposition, who was not able to mobilize people for years. So I think this is also something different about this campaign we've observed, and overall, like, it all added up to this sort of opportunity for changes.
Well, to elaborate on the Sven and your remarks on the social movements and their structure, over the last decade, we have seen many democratic social movements that, mobilize thousands of people, in the streets, especially with ambitious political goals. To give a concrete example, in Turkey, in Gezi Park, thousands of people were protesting against the government. However, a few of them is actually achieved a political goal. Most of them organizedly and structurally were weak. For example, they had not have a strong leadership or loose organization. When you look at the Belarusian politics, what kind of strengths the current protests, what kind of strengths and weaknesses do you see that it will determine its fate? Sven?
Yeah, I think this is one of the crucial questions, how to turn this social protest, or this, in this case, political protest, into political capital, right? So this was what was not, to a certain degree, possible with the Gezi Park protest, it seems, and that's why, to a certain degree, fall flat. I mean, not to discount all of the achievements that people have reached there, but to a certain degree, protest movements in the Arab Spring or the Gezi Park protests haven't turned fully into the political capital that they wanted to have. And I think for Belarusians, it's crucial to think about the question how to turn these capacities that they have to bring thousands, hundreds of thousands at cases to the streets into political change. And that's the crucial question of anybody who works in politics, right? How to turn the attention and the commitment of people into actual political change. Because sometimes in our new media ages, where like mobilization of people is rather easy, right, through whatever, Facebook, Twitter, or in the case of Belarus, through Telegram, is rather efficient and effective to be organized. But then ultimately 100,000 of people on the streets itself doesn't change much, right? There is no political achievement from there or per se. So not to discount, again, like people going to the streets, raising awareness. And as I said, the politicization of the Belarusian society is already a great achievement. But at one point, such movements want to turn stuff into real political change and long-lasting political change. And there we can look at different case studies and how they try to have done it. Like we have seen now all over the world kind of protest movements and how they deal with it. The Belarusians are organized very decentralized through Telegram channels without to a certain degree, clear leadership. And I will say a couple more things in a second about that. And then we have protests in Romania a couple of years back against corruption, but then also against highly controversial homosexuality case in the constitution. And then we have current corruption protests in Bulgaria, for example, ongoing. We had the Gezi Park protests, as you already mentioned, in Turkey, or we have the Arab Spring protests. And which of those movements turned stuff into political change? I think if we follow the storyline of people like Zeynep Tufekci, there might be something that was not achieved by the Gezi Park protest or the Arab Spring, but might have been achieved by Romanian protesters or now Bulgarian protesters. And the main difference that I see, having worked in politics for quite a while now and having worked with many different organizations, is that at one point there was a political spin-off of these movements. So, for example, in Bulgaria, you have political parties that kind of spin off these movements or these mass protests. The same in Romania, right, with Union Save Romania as a clear movement, kind of spinning off the movement without separating the movement. And I think at the same time, this is something that Belarusians are thinking hard at the moment, trying to spin off political capital. That means classical political structures like political parties or political leaders of a movement without ruining the movement itself, because there can always be clashes. And as I said earlier, this is already something that is in the movement debated quite heatedly, because once people announced that they will found a new party, that will basically also represent a lot of these values that the movements represent, they were criticized for spinning that off right now, because right now they're all together and don't want to separate into smaller units. However, I think long term, you need political structures in the sense of hierarchical organization through a party, and then leveraging upon all the infrastructure that you have already created. Because in an authoritarian context, I think it is crucial that you have not the classical model of only political parties or only decentralized protests. Because if you only have hierarchical order, like for example, a very strong charismatic leader against the strong man in office, then the dictator has a very easy option, namely to remove that charismatic leader, that opposition leader, or that opposition party. And that's what we have seen from Lukashenko in the past, and that's what we have seen again this year, when, for example, I would say the strongest contender in the race was Viktor Babarika. He was detained. So was Sergei Tikhanovsky, and Tsepkalo ultimately flew the country. So there was a clear attack. Like, this is kind of a thing that autocrats know how to deal with, right? How to remove the hierarchical contenders to power. Now what we see is autocrats like Lukashenko having to react to a decentralized structure without a clear leader. There are many different Telegram channels. There are many different people who organize stuff. So it's very hard to compete with them. However, on the other side, this has a lot of downturns also for the movement, because they don't have an overarching voice. They are not as efficient and streamlined in their communication, and they don't have somebody to rally behind. And I predicted a couple of weeks ago that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, after some time, will take on this spot again of trying to lead this movement. And it seems to have turned out true, because she's much more active as a leader, because I think people understand that a completely leaderless movement like we had in Gezi or the Arab Spring might not turn into political capital. So I hope that kind of makes sense what I'm saying here, but it's ultimately about structures of protests. It's about structures of political organization. And maybe I'm a bit conservative there, but I think leaderless protest cannot succeed in the long run, because it has always to be captivated by classical political structures.
Well, upon this, I would like you to ask, do you see any possibility that in the Belarusian protest, the way that it's organized and structured, there's a possibility that they can turn the movement into a resilient social movement and institutionalize it? Do you see any kind of trends or prospects, Sven?
Yeah, in fact, I think people are thinking hard about these questions that I just outlined. Like, you know, I just observe from the sidelines. But when I talk to people who are very engaged in the movement itself, this is questions that they pose themselves, how they can spin it up. And I think, as I said, there are people who try to found structures behind, because as we also have to recognize, I mean, there has always been opposition to Lukashenko, but these classical opposition parties, became in these movements almost irrelevant, to a point of irrelevancy right now. Right now, it's over. This kind of new political protests are overshadowing everything, and the leaders that are now there, like Tikhanovskaya or Kolesnikova, these are people completely. Kolesnikova, I wouldn't say new to the scene, but this doesn't resonate with the classical opposition structures, and also the way they appeal to a new audience that hasn't been there in the past. The opposition movements have been anchored in certain strongholds, for example, more in the west and the east of the country, but also like in terms of course, more Minsk elite circles than in the provinces amongst working class people. So again, somebody like Tikhanovskaya, and especially her husband, he resonates with a completely new audience. And again, embedding this all into political structures is what they think hard about. And I don't think that you have to now found a party and do it old school style. What I'm advocating more is like a hybrid model of you have this whole decentralized infrastructure that is very well organized already as a side product of the response to COVID by civil society, and then combine this with political structures as well as charismatic leaders. As far as I know, this is or as far as my judgment goes, this is the most promising route. And that's something I think that when people look to Russia, they find also very promising there. Alexei Navalny was even in the absence trying, even in the absence when he was poisoned, was able to turn certain political changes in, or certain good political results in, at the local election. So therefore, he has the structures as well as the charismatic leader. So I think this hybrid model is actually also promising for Belarus.
Well, Shimisina, would you agree with Sven's argument that the current democratic protests in Belarus, their organization and structure, is not suitable to build a resilient social movement?
I would say that the current structure is and was for past month maybe the best decision that the protesters could have formed, in a sense that if there was a clear leader in Belarus, he or she would be imprisoned immediately and the movement would be sort of beheaded. And with the same, like with the tactics of like there were certain like criticism from, let's say, Ukrainians who were interested in the situation in Belarus, or even some Belarusians from the old school opposition structures. There was criticism like, why do people do not gather on the street, on the square, and not trying to attack the government buildings, or try not to sort of occupy one place in the city and stay there to repeat the Maidan scenario. Those tactics would have been inefficient in Belarusian conditions, just because the Siloviki are well trained and they know well how to manage this and how to remove people from the streets in that way. And so I would say that what is new and good during this protest, something that was lacking in the previous years, was that this protest is at the moment decentralized, that the coordination is managed through Telegram, in that the democratic leaders such as Tikhanovskaya or Coordination Council, that some of those people managed to leave the country and that they continue to work from abroad, both addressing Belarusians domestically, but also reaching out to the international community, speaking at international forums, calling for sanctions and other response from international community, and sort of continuing their work from abroad. And here I would like to bring up that both the Coordination Council and the Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, they try to form the parallel structures, trying to represent or to appoint representatives, let's say, on human rights, on youth issues, on economic transition solutions, trying to think strategically what happens if the current system of the government collapses, if Lukashenko leaves one way or another, and trying to offer solutions for the new Belarus, to have the alternative version of the new constitution or the constitutional amendments, trying to fill those gaps in case if the vacuum of power happens in Belarus at some point, if the political crisis reaches sort of new highs. And I mean that there is a parallel structure of the democratic forces, and they do provide those like solutions for the future. And if they operated inside Belarus, they would be put in prison like overnight, and the movement won't be so sustainable. But of course, the protest in its current form cannot continue indefinitely, and there should be some new tactics used. And this is something, again, the democratic forces are trying to inspire. I mean, like Tikhanovskaya and others, and the protesters on the ground also self-organize. One of the interesting trends is that people do gather with their neighbors in their neighborhoods, and this also creates something for a more sustainable structure, and possibly like the structure of resistance and consolidation, which is local and decentralized. And also, again, like the protests cannot, like people do not necessarily have this motivation to show up on the streets indefinitely, but there are reports from the independent labor unions that those who join the strikes, some do not join the strikes openly, but they go on to the covert strike strategies, trying to sort of to work to the rule, abide to the rule, essentially like not working, and doing other non-violent resistance techniques. And I totally agree with Sven when he was saying that there should be a more like consolidated political structure for the future. Again, a good question, how people can unite now in the current circumstances, at the time when any political figure who is more or less visible in Belarus is now either being put in prison at the moment, or like literally like few days ago when, let's say, the representative of Tikhanovskaya team for youth affairs, Alana, she was put in KGB prison as a suspect for a criminal case. And essentially, like, anyone who's visible in Belarus now is at the forefront of like repressions, and they are neutralized. And then there is this gap between people like Belarusians who managed to escape the country. They try to stay in touch with the situation on the ground, but there is also like the limitation. There is this much they can do to affect the change inside the country. But as long as the protest lasts, and as long as it stays peaceful, this makes Belarusians being taken seriously by the international community, and it adds some pressure for the international community, for places like OSCE to insist on mediation, for the EU, let's say, and US, like other powers, to support the Belarusian uprising, and to facilitate or to advocate for national dialogue, and to cooperate with the democratic Belarusian structures for some sort of a political solution.
Yeah, can I jump in after this, Serkan, quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I fully agree with Katerina on this. I think this is crucial to understand. I don't advocate for like political structures right now, traditional political structures. In fact, they seem to have failed to promote to get similar results that now the decentralized protests are gathering. But again, you also cannot really make the case against that in a comparable way, because now a lot of factors came together this year that might also just influence the bias. So it wouldn't always be a fair comparison. I think, however, I agree that the decentralized protests, the way they are formed right now with this digital infrastructure behind them, is the only way that Lukashenko and his regime could be seriously challenged, and the way people could organize, because precisely of the factor that in autocratic structures and autocratic political environments, people will otherwise just remove by forms of suppression, repression, and surveillance people that are at the head of these political movements. And again, that's what we have seen very early on, I think in June, or whenever Babarika was taken away and Tikhanovsky was also detained. So I think this was the only way. But again, if we want to create long-lasting political change, then we have to think what will be the next steps. And there we also have to consider that at one point there might be constitutional reform carried out in Belarus, and there's hotly debated how this actually might look like. And the most likely shift that we will see in Belarusian politics in the next couple of years, or even months now, is that the switch from the presidential to a parliamentary system. And that could mean that at one point political structures might become actually even more important. But again, this is all like talking about a very ambiguous future. So let's see how this actually turns out. But what I'm advocating is not like, okay, classical case of political structure should be implemented. What I'm saying is really like these hybrid movements seem to be very promising in this structure, especially when we look at long-lasting political change. And that's what people are thinking here about. Because when you talk to people here on the streets, then people are say Lukashenko is done. It's just a matter of time, right? And of course, this is that mindset overly hopeful, especially considering those who opposing him have like a lot of repressions to face. But it seems to be that there is the consensus that he's done. But now let's see how to turn all of these agreements that people have into political capital. And I think that's worth thinking about more.
Well, one thing also that's really interesting about the democratic protest, the women participation in is pretty high, which I assume it was not the case in the past protest, and they became the actually symbol of resistance to repressive regime of Lukashenko. What do you think are the social implication of this trend, and how would you evaluate it? Shimitsina?
Well, there was definitely a lot of attention to this phenomenon of Belarusian women being at the forefront of the democratic movement during this protest and during the electoral campaign. I would, however, approach this with a little bit of maybe skepticism, in a sense that this women leadership does not mean that we are doing great in terms of gender equality in the political domain, in terms of decision making, be it business or politics. I would say that women found themselves in this position of leadership by chance, which played to their advantage. And then again, it's a good question if the men front runners of the presidential race, if they remained in the race. It's a good question whether the population would have voted for a woman with similar portfolio, which would be like, let's say, like similar to the men front runners, because there were some polls, public opinion polls in the previous years, which showed that a typical candidate in the understanding of the typical Belarusian, that a president is someone who's like a man in his, I don't know, like 40s, who is married, has kids. And again, like it's a good question if someone would have voted for similar competitive women candidate. And again, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya found herself like very spontaneously at this scene, and the women's trio Kolesnikova, Tsepkala, and Tikhanovskaya, they got united, and they showed a brilliant case of how women can get united, and they essentially made something incredible. They've united their teams during the presidential race in a more timely and consolidated manner than compared to like their peers in the previous years, where there were so many quarrels between the political teams of candidates in the previous years, and they could not essentially present a single candidate from the opposition on the elections. But I would also say that the success, again, like I'm maybe talking about this from the standpoint of criticism, it is a very attractive image for the media, and it was disseminated all over the world on the front pages of the media outlets, showing that like, oh, here we see like women political leadership, and it was like, again, easily disseminated by media. And this is no secret that to a certain extent this this campaign had a lot of talented PR, creative strategists, PR experts who took part in this presidential race, who presented very well-packed, well-presented media products. So I would say, like, to some extent, this could be attributed to this like talented PR strategy applied to the this presidential campaign. But one way or another, women did have a chance to claim themselves, like to present themselves in a very effective, favorable way during this campaign. And for sure they will, and they are at the moment transforming this in their political leadership, playing this to their advantage. And we see this at the how Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is like skyrocketing her portfolio, how she's shining brightly, consolidating support around her, and how brilliantly she is working and sort of like growing as a political figure, how fast she's learning, and how she's setting an example for other women in Belarus. So again, like this definitely would be translated into political capital, and is translated among the political structures. And even in the public perception, when there was a question of like whether a woman could be or should be a political leader, whether she has the capacity to do so, now a few would doubt that women are as capable as men. I mean, by the example of Maria Kolesnikova, Kolesnikova, who is who was more courageous than some of other political figures. Like, some managed to escape in similar circumstances. They allowed for the police security services to sort of to leave the country, forcefully leave the country, and she was having the guts to stay when she ripped her passport, and even at the face of threats, when she was threatened that she would be killed if she refuses to leave the country, she still decided to do so, and demonstrated how courageous she is.
Well, Sven, you also had a chance to participate, and as far as I remember, you did a few of the protests, and you directly observed the people in there and the social background they have. So how would you comment on the women participation in protest and the social implication of this?
Yeah, I mean, I overall agree with what has been said, but I think there's an interesting division in the protest, especially early on after the presidential election. So after the presidential elections, people went to the masses, to the streets, internet was down, and there was certainly all peaceful, but there were also some people who were more, especially in the days after, 2 or 3 days after, more in favor of confrontation, right? And this was in the movement heavily debated, and people on the streets discussed this heavily, whether there should be more confrontation, whether there should be the use of force or not from the protesters. And I think here, the clearer cut generals in Belarus and helped to essentialize certain features. Okay, to say there was a clear cut support for less violence, for peaceful protest, and that's why once there was some aggressive moves from some of the Telegram channels, especially Nechta, to call for more escalation of the protests, they organized women's marches, dressed very symbolically in white, handed out flowers to scale that back. And I think these traditional gender roles that are put out there, like the men more aggressive and the women in favor of peaceful protests, is something that they're using strategically to a certain degree. Again, it's not that all agree on one side and the others there, but as I said, this is a lot also about who has the strategic advantage in how the movement is proceeding. Because again, like people observing this, I would say the movement itself is very heterogeneous. So there is a common agreement about certain topics that everybody agrees upon, but how to achieve these goals, there are radically different views. And that is just natural when a lot of apolitical people join together. Some people who come from very old political structures, they want to achieve it in that way. Others think that now radical turnover and even violence is justified, and others want to keep it very want to keep it completely peaceful. And here, I think the established roles of the genders played out in almost like a marketing way that Katerina was just explaining, right? There is a peaceful portray of female leadership, and then there is a more confrontative way. And over the last couple of weeks and months, the peaceful way has certainly gathered more attention, has been proven successful to the movement itself. So I think that plays a larger role that is often overlooked. And again, this is very thin ice because it essentializes certain genders, but that's how I see it playing out to a certain degree. That there's almost like a strategic move to say this is one direction we could go, and then there's the other way that we could go. And in the end, it seems there's much more support for peaceful protests. And again, they have to think about long-lasting effects, like how much support would the protests have amongst the general population if they would turn violent. And there there seems to be in a society like Belarus, who is so conflict averse due to its history, there seems to be very little support for overall violence. However, if you talk to people on the streets, especially in the last couple of days, there are a lot of people incredibly frustrated, and they challenge this paradigm. But again, it helps there that the very strong female leaders are established and they have a clear-cut strategy how to do that, how to deal with that, namely in a peaceful manner.
Well, thank you for the response. I want to just come back to the one point that we just discussed about the organizational and structural of the Belarusian democratic protest. And I would like you to share your possible scenarios or what's going to happen in the near future, because what we see from today is Lukashenko still seems to maintain his power. But what do you think it's going to unfold, Katerina?
Well, it is ungrateful to talk about scenarios, predictions, and particularly about some time frame. I would say that first, Lukashenko is illegitimate in the eyes of the people, and the scale of the protest is so strong and large that it makes it impossible for the system to function in the manner it used to. And I mean that, again, even if those who do not protest explicitly, the level of disgust with the current regime is high and unprecedented, and the level of sort of civil disobedience, which is expressed in many ways. Like, there are people who do not show their discontent openly, but they go on more covert techniques, like, let's say, with like closing their businesses, joining the strikes, or like working to the rule, essentially like stopping the work at the enterprise, etc. And this makes it impossible to go back to the status quo the way it functioned in the previous years. And I think that Lukashenko won't stay for the whole presidential term. This is something that he's been saying actually in the past month as well. He might try, and something that he's trying to do, he's trying to divide the opposition with orchestrating, making this sort of like puppet opposition with Voskresensky, who was quite recently released from prison and now trying to orchestrate some sort of national dialogue and advocating for the constitutional reform. I don't think that would be successful. I mean, they could still conduct those kind of decorative measures, but this won't be widely accepted by the people. I think that again, the protest mood won't go away anywhere anytime soon, even if people do not show up on the streets, or like it could be very tiring, and the protest could subside for a while. Meaning that, let's say, like maybe next Sunday, there won't be people showing up on the streets in that many figures, but people would still continue to form this local groups of resistance and use other forms of like peaceful resistance and opposition to the regime. And again, like for the system won't function as effectively as it used to in the previous years. And there's also this high level of mistrust between the people in the power vertical, because some are ready to change sides, and Lukashenko himself, he reshuffles people, appoints new Minister of Interior, other officials, also, which adds up on this distrust on who could resign, who could sort of betray the system. And again, hard to talk about the time frame, but I think that this development would bring its fruits in the month. Like, it's not a short-term thing. We won't see it change overnight, but we have crossed the point of no return for the Belarusians. Like, they won't accept Lukashenko leadership in the long run.
So you think that there's a great possibility that Lukashenko will not be in power in his full presidential term? Did I get right?
Yeah, and I think that one of the scenarios, like, I think that for Lukashenko, he's still thinking that he can oppress the people with this Siloviki brutal actions, but actually the more repressive he acts, the more outrage it brings among the society, and the more disgust he actually initiates among the people. And again, like, I think that this is one of the strategies he's trying to use, but it doesn't work. And another strategy could be for him to sort of prepare for some sort of exit on the premises of this constitutional reform, trying to sell this idea to Russia and the West that he would conduct a constitutional reform and then he would leave on some terms. But the more cruelties he commits, the less opportunities for exit he has for himself. In the sense that he becomes more and more complicit in crimes which are subject to investigation by even like foreign states, following the principle of universal jurisdiction. And the more like, well, he cuts the ways for any sort of peaceful dialogue which could have happened between him and the opposition.
Well, Sven, when you look at the prospect of this democratic protest, and you already mentioned that there are some weaknesses that this social movement might not turn into a political capital, how do you expect this situation to unfold?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to predict, and Lukashenko himself knows that it is very hard to predict, because every time a dictator has to leave, this is like the exit option for an autocrat is always the hardest question, right? That's why they stay so long in power to a certain degree, because you deprive them of, they deprive themselves of all exit options, to be honest. And I posted a Twitter thread before the elections of all the autocrats that Lukashenko was meeting over the years, because he of course knows the experiences that some of them had, right? Like, he knows Gaddafi, you know, he knows what happened to Gaddafi afterwards. So therefore, I think is very concerned about his exit options, because at this point, the point of him staying in power until the next election is just, I think, not happening there. As I said earlier, I think there's a vast national consensus that he not only rigged the election, but that he also should resign. So therefore, he really has to deliberate about his exit options, and they get harder with the day. As I said, the opposition gave him to a certain degree a leeway for quite extended period of time, but now with announcing the tribunal and like the protests are now always chanting, you know, Lukashenko in front of the Hague, and Lukashenko should go to an international tribunal. So this whole complicity issue becomes more and more pressing with the day that passes. And so for him, there are only a couple of options, right? One, he will be overthrown by force. I don't see that happening because of the topics that we discussed beforehand, that the whole enforcement apparatus is still behind him, because they also lack the exit options. So that's, I think, rather unlikely, but again, could also happen if there is one incident, right? There could always be one incident. I always think that that this can always happen in such an unloaded environment, that everything could be released with one incredible incident that happens, that mass mobilize and that people overthrow, or like people dissident, like there will be dissidents en masse. But I don't see that happening in Belarus. The second option could be, of course, he at one point offers the constitutional reform and therefore backs down his own power position. They're currently having a presidential system that he implemented very early on in his reign, and with the referendums early on, 1995 and so on, and change it to a more parliamentary system, and then promotes either his people of his own liking, or just divides the opposition, as we just mentioned. That is an option. I think maybe the most likely option that we will have something like this. That there will be a constitutional reform, and then some of these movements will spill off into more classical political structures, and then we will see how this will be taken from there. Or, of course, at one point, Russia also drops him, or people in the power structure drop him. I think most of the viewership might be familiar with, in fact, the works of with the topic of preference falsificationism, right? So Timur Kuran, as hypothesis makes a lot of sense here, where people don't actually talk about their preferences openly. It's very hard to understand the preferences of the people in power too, right? They might be able to switch sides anytime if there is one incident that happens, but however, you cannot measure preference falsification properly. Therefore, very hard to see. There could be an internal reshuffle in the government, and then things might slow down. because they might just say, okay, now we make a purge or like a cleaning up the law enforcement structures due to the new government reshuffle. But again, I also don't see that happening necessarily, but it's also very hard to predict. So we are in a political environment where anything is very hard to predict. So let's see what in the end turns out. But that Lukashenko is done is, I think, agreed upon amongst most people, at least.
But you disagree with Shimitsina that people are clearly against Lukashenko. They clearly turn against him in every aspect of the society.
No, they are against him. Like this, that's the national consensus. He's done. Like Lukashenko is done. It's just like which scenario will play out. We don't know which scenario will play out because it's very hard to predict what will be the most likely one. But it doesn't finish his term. I fully agree, and the sooner the better. In fact, but I mean, again, very hard to see what is the right trigger to the regime change here.
It looks like the Belarusian politics is as complex as Turkish politics. So thanks for joining us. It was very good to talking with you, discussing the interesting points. Thanks for the audiences as well as. If you have any closing remarks you'd like to share, please do. Shimitsina.
I would say that, well, it is hard, of course, to predict the scenarios, but one thing is for sure that the Belarusian nation has stood in the path of sort of reawakening, and people got the sense of their own dignity and the deep request for the democracy, human rights, and the quality change of the regime, and the struggle for democracy. So this is something irreversible and very significant for the future of the country.
Sven?
Yeah, politicization is hard to turn back. And you said Turkish politics and Belarusian politics are both very complicated. To a certain degree, I agree, and I disagree on one part. Like, at least politics has always been a feature of Turkish life, right? People always talked about politics. Here, this is a rather new phenomenon to many circles. Again, sometimes like people deliberately took politics off the table when I wanted to raise it in the past when I worked here, but now it is everywhere, and I think there is no turning back, and this is, I think, a good seed amongst which in the future pro-democracy movements and also democracy can start to build upon. So this politicization is the crucial step.
Thank you all. Hopefully when we gather again, we can talk about the downfall of the Lukashenko and its effects. And that's all.